Hey, peace. What's happening, everyone? What I deal with?
Recognize royalty. Recognize it. Recognize royalty. Gotta recognize it. Recognize royalty. Like they ain't got eyes to recognize royalty.
I can feel.
Recognize royalty.
I can see.
Recognize royalty.
Now I recognize.
Royalty.
Royal to these eyes.
Royalty.
I can see.
Recognize royalty.
I can love again.
Recognize royalty.
Now I recognize.
I recognize it.
Royalty.
I recognize it.
Yeah, peace once again. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notifications. All of that helps. Blessings. So today I want to talk a little bit about reparations and specifically the foundational Black American claim for reparations and what it's based on. Apparently their reparations claims is based on not just their experience with slavery, but post-slavery, their experiences with Jim Crow, redlining, and things of that sort. They also claim that only foundational Black Americans should receive reparations in America, because only Black Americans have a lineage of slavery. But they're not just asking for reparations for slavery. And so my question is, what about the Black Americans, the Black immigrants from the Caribbean or Africa who experienced Jim Crow in America or redlining? Because there were Caribbean people and Africans in America during the Jim Crow era, and absolutely during redlining. And so my question is, why don't those Caribbean people and Africans that experienced Jim Crow, why don't they qualify for reparations? Why is it that it has to go all the way back to slavery, but they're not asking for just stuff that happened to them during slavery? So that's my concern. That's my question. Have Caribbean Black people and Africans, have they experienced discrimination through Jim Crow and stuff like that? Granted that the population of non-FBA Blacks in the South may have been very small, but regardless of how small it was, wouldn't the descendants of those people also have a right or a claim to reparations if they can show that they lived in the South during the Jim Crow era? And I think they should. I don't get if FBA is going to claim that reparations is not just about slavery, but about stuff that happened after slavery, then anyone who experienced the stuff after slavery should also have a reparations claim. But I think, it's not just Caribbeans in the South, and it's not just about living in the South. I think Jim Crow existed to some degree in the North as well. And that's kind of what I want to talk about just a little bit, I want to, do the usual chat GPT and ask a few questions and see what we come up with in terms of who would qualify to have a reparations claim. And again, my argument is that whether you are FBA or non-FBA, as long as you're a Black immigrant who experienced Jim Crow or redlining, you should have a claim. So the first question that I'm going to ask ChatGPT is, were there Jim Crow laws in the northern states? Again, there were a lot of Blacks in the North that were of Caribbean descent, African descent, just non-FBA Blacks, who may have, encountered Jim Crow laws or Jim Crow type of discrimination in the North. And so I just want to talk about that a little bit. So were there Jim Crow laws in the northern states? And it says, while Jim Crow laws were primarily associated with the southern United States, de facto segregation and discriminatory practices also existed in the northern states, even though they were not always written into law. Northern states, no Jim Crow laws on the books like in the South. It says most northern states did not pass explicit laws mandating racial segregation in the same way southern states did. The South's Jim Crow system involved legally enforced segregation in schools, transportation, restaurants, public accommodations, voting restrictions, example, literacy tests and poll taxes. But de facto segregation existed in the North. Instead of formal laws, the North relied on unwritten rules, discriminatory policies, and institutional racism, including redlining by banks and the federal government to segregate housing, racially restrictive covenants in real estate deeds, employment discrimination, keeping Black people in low-paying jobs, segregated schools due to housing patterns and local policies, violent resistance to integration, example, Northern race riots, Boston's busing crisis. So yeah, that, this is what is being called de facto segregation. But interestingly enough, it is still labeled as institutional racism. If we are going to talk about institutional racism, and if institutional racism is part of our claim for reparations, institutional racism means systemic racism, or it's another way of just kind of speaking about white supremacy. And if white supremacy, institutional racism, systemic racism is all a part of our claim for reparations, why would it only be for FBA? Aren't all Blacks in America victims of institutional racism or systemic racism or white supremacy? Why would that claim be only for foundational Black Americans? That doesn't make sense to me. I also asked ChatGPT what percent of Blacks in the northern states were of Caribbean descent during this time. And it says, to give a solid answer, here's a breakdown of the percentage of Black people in northern U.S. states who were of Caribbean descent, focusing on the Jim Crow era, late 1800s to mid 1900s, especially during the Great Migration and Harlem Renaissance periods, which is the 1910s to the 40s. It said the estimated percent of Caribbean descent Blacks in northern cities, early to mid 20th century, in New York City. By 1930, roughly 10 to 15% of the Black population in New York City was West Indian or Caribbean descent, mostly from Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and Haiti. In Harlem, that percentage could be as high as 25%, especially among cultural elites and professionals. Boston and Philadelphia, Caribbean descent Blacks made up 5 to 10% of the Black population in the early 20th century. Nationwide, likely under 5% of the total Black population in the North during the Jim Crow era was Caribbean-born or of Caribbean descent, though concentrated in certain urban areas. So, again, even though the overall percentage was pretty low, Caribbean people were concentrated in a few cities in the North. But the point is that they were there, and they too were victims of institutional racism and white supremacy. And if reparations claim is going to bring up institutional racism and white supremacy, then they would have to be a part of that claim. Why wouldn't they be a part of that claim? And why wouldn't even Caribbean people today who have lived in America for years, why wouldn't they have a claim? Because they would have to have been victims of institutional or systemic racism and of white supremacy as well. White supremacy did not just, go by them, didn't ignore their being here. And so again, why wouldn't they have a claim for reparations as well? And why wouldn't blacks in the North? I don't think it was just FBA blacks in the North that were being discriminated against due to redlining, restrictive covenants in real estate. I don't think they made a distinction between who's a black person that's always been in America or who's a black person that migrated here recently. I think that those covenants were kind of across the board in terms of black people. Same with employment discrimination and segregated schools. Again, I think it was across the board. It wasn't just FBA blacks that couldn't go to white schools. It was all blacks, regardless of where you came from. ChatGPT gave a couple more examples of violent resistance to integration in the North. It says in Chicago, there were segregated neighborhoods, redlining, and school segregation. In Detroit, the Detroit plan tried to limit black migration into white areas. Was that only FBA migration from the South? Or was that black migration from everywhere? Blacks from the Caribbean? No blacks were allowed into these white areas. In New York City, there was informal school segregation. Informal school segregation persisted through zoning. And in Boston, they resisted school integration efforts well into the 70s, well into the 1970s. There was this resistance. So again, my question is, was that resistance and the violence and the segregation, was that only relegated for FBA blacks? Were Caribbean blacks welcomed into white neighborhoods and white schools? Were African blacks, were they exempt from redlining? And if they were not, if all of this de facto segregation was across the board for all blacks that lived in America, why would at least that portion of reparations, why would that portion of reparations, the post-slavery portion or claim for reparations, why would that just be for foundational black Americans? That just doesn't sound right to me. And if the idea is that, Jim Crow was, what happened in the South in terms of Jim Crow was a legal form of segregation and there were laws, and that's why this is more worthy of reparations than the de facto segregation that happened in the North, then if that's true, then FBA should rightfully be asking for reparations from those southern states, not from the federal government. If you're asking for reparations from the federal government, then the blacks in the North that experience this de facto segregation, stuff with busing and all of those other things that we spoke about, they have a right to the reparations that is being paid out by the federal government because of this type of discrimination. as certainly as immigrants, there are certainly immigrants that did not experience the slavery in the South. And if that disqualifies them from getting reparations, then the fact that there are FBA in the North that didn't experience Jim Crow, why doesn't that disqualify them from reparations, or at least reduce their reparations claim? All blacks, all FBA cannot have the same reparations claim, because not all blacks, not all FBA had the same experience in America. They may have all experienced slavery, but they didn't all experience Jim Crow, redlining, all of the post slavery stuff. Not all FBA people experience that, so they can't all be entitled to the same reparations claim. So in summary, ChatGPT says Southern Jim Crow was a legalized racial segregation, but Northern discrimination was informal but still widespread. Both systems oppressed African Americans, but through different legal mechanisms. And again, by African Americans, I don't think they're just talking about FBA. So again, my question is, if you're going to claim that reparations is about slavery and post-slavery behavior of white society, then why wouldn't non-FBA blacks have a claim for reparations? Why can't non-FBA blacks or Caribbean blacks who have been here for centuries, why can't they make a claim against redlining? And we know Caribbeans and Africans were here during that time. So is FBA going to make some type of concession for non-FBA blacks to have a claim for reparations as well? Or are they still saying that if you don't have slavery lineage that goes back to the 1800s, then you have no claim? And even more importantly, wouldn't that, if they say that blacks that experienced only Jim Crow and redlining, if you say those blacks do not qualify for reparations, does that not take away from the FBA argument for reparations? Because your argument is that you were strongly affected by Jim Crow and redlining. And so you are taken away from that argument by saying people who only experienced Jim Crow and redlining shouldn't get reparations. Because why? Because that just doesn't have a long-term effect, a generational wealth effect on those Caribbean people that may have been redlined against or had or experienced segregation. Why wouldn't those people have some form of a claim? And again, I think that you are making this argument at your own expense, because you are kind of putting your own argument, you're just downplaying what you say is your claim for reparations. That's the argument I want to put forth, is that unless you make room for non-FBA blacks to have a claim in reparations, you are diminishing your own reparations claim. In order for your argument that only FBA people should get reparations in America, in order for that argument to hold, then you would have to take away Jim Crow, redlining, institutional racism, systemic racism, white supremacy. all of that would have to be taken away from your reparations claim. And the only thing you would be claiming reparations for is slavery. Because anything after slavery was experienced by non-FBA Americans, by just Black immigrants and their descendants. And so you would have to eliminate all of that from your claim in order to say that only you can get reparations here. And I think that is the conundrum that you find yourself in. When you say you're the only ones that should get reparations, you are literally diminishing your own reparations claim. A lot of the blacks that lived in the South migrated to the North after the Civil War and after the First World War. Maybe half of the blacks that lived down south migrated north. And because of that, they likely did not experience Jim Crow. Jim Crow was mainly relegated in those southern states, and Jim Crow laws took effect after close to half of the black population had left to live up north, looking for industrial jobs. So would those blacks that migrated north during the Great Migration that never experienced Jim Crow, why are they entitled to the same reparations that the blacks that stayed down south, that they are entitled to? Wouldn't the blacks that did not migrate, wouldn't they be entitled to more reparations than the ones that left? I mean, and that's if we agree that reparations is not just about slavery, that it's also about Jim Crow and everything that followed slavery. And interestingly enough, I think that's kind of why, or at least I'm wondering if that's the reason why they don't want, why they wanted to just go back to slavery. Like, you have to trace your lineage back to slavery, because that bypasses the whole Jim Crow era thing. But there's just something, I want to say unfair about the idea that they wanted, where black people who experienced Jim Crow in the South, and again, granted that this is less than 1% of the population in the South were of Caribbean or African descent, but still, these are thousands of people who have descendants and should have a claim to some form of reparations. And, their claim to reparations should be on par with the claim for the blacks that left the South and never experienced Jim Crow. And so for that reason, I think that, those black immigrants, if we are being fair, those black immigrants would be entitled to some form of reparations as well. If black Americans, foundational black Americans that did not experience Jim Crow, and there are thousands of them, there are actually millions of them that migrated to the North and never experienced Jim Crow, if they're still entitled to reparations, then so are the black immigrants in the South that did experience Jim Crow. That less than 1% of black immigrants that lived in the South that did experience Jim Crow, they have a stake in reparations. And so would the black immigrants in the North that that experienced the de facto segregation that happened in the North, they would also be entitled to reparations as well. If foundational Black Americans in the North, who got to the North by migrating north after the Civil War and after both World Wars, and so never experienced Jim Crow, if FBA that did not experience Jim Crow have a claim to reparations, then so do the Black immigrants in the South that experienced Jim Crow and not slavery. And also so do the immigrants in the North that experienced de facto segregation and not slavery. That just seems right. That just seems right and logical. Yeah, so, that's my argument and I'm sticking with it. That's my argument and I'm sticking with it. So, once again, hit that like button, please. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. All of that helps. And as usual, we'll catch you on the next one. Peace.
Recognize royalty, recognize it, recognize royalty, gotta recognize it, recognize royalty, like they ain't got eyes to recognize royalty.
I can feel.
Recognize royalty,
I can see.
recognize royalty,
Now I recognize
royalty,
royalty's eyes.
royalty,
I can see.
recognize royalty,
I can love
recognize royalty,
Now I
recognize it.
royalty.
I recognize passion. Never just the man with the title in his hand, with the vital in his hand, with the Bible in his hand. You never just the man with the scepter in demand, with the lecture in the stand, with the vector and the candle. Can you understand the grand from the texture of the hand? Hard at work, are you hard at work? Working with the man, don't kiss the ring of royalty. Crown him king, just a thing, letting loyalty ring. Bring frankincense and myrrh and other things. As gold already blings from the highest that prizes no sins. Recognizing kings overruling commandments with the Trinity and the power it brings. When you recognize royalty, I feel it.
I can see.
Yeah, I see it.
Now
I recognize now.
royalty's eyes.
Royalty,
I can see.
I see it.
I can love again.
Now I'm in love now. I recognize your passion.
Royalty.
Recognize royalty, sunrise royally. Sitting on top of the world, I vibe morally. Status of a king for surely. Orally, we pop dumb things till we stop the impurity. We pop them just for recognition. Listen to the missionary on a mission with the visionary vision. Do you recognize intuition? I reel in men when I went out fishing. I'll tell you why they rocked the boat. Cause they didn't understand what the prophet wrote. What's the conniption? To choose the Jews' crucifixion and refuse recognition at son child's christening. In the mix, I'm in some. Insist they fix the system from malarkey back to my monarchy. Yeah, back above me. Don't soil my purple and blue, and I will recognize your royalty too.
I can feel you.
I feel it.
I can see.